Good evening, my wonderful economists. Today we're going to be considering market equilibrium and government interventions. Previously, we looked at demand and supply and their interactions in a price and quantity related graphs. Today we're going to be looking at market equilibrium, which is of course set by the interactions between our demand and supply curves. As you can see here, again, just a quick little bit of revision. Our demand curve depicts our law of demand, which indicates that consumers tend to buy more of a product the cheaper it gets. Supply, on the other hand, is from the producer's standpoint, and they want to supply more to the market the higher the price gets. Now we're going to be examining the impact of these government policies on market outcomes. So first things we need to know is how do changes in demand actually get depicted on this graph. So if, for example, there is a change in the price of the product, what you will see is a movement along the demand curve, depicted here at point C. What would happen is there would be an increase in price. This would reduce the quantity demanded. But the curve itself would not shift. Why? Because it is only a change in price which has occurred. If, however, there is a shift in the demand curve, this means that there has been a change in any one of the demand determinants we covered last week. That includes income, tastes and preferences changing, technology advancements, anything that could either improve or increase our demand or decrease our demand that was completely unrelated to price changes. Changes in supply, again, same thing. If there is a shift in the price, that would cause a movement from point A to point B, depicted in the graph on the right-hand side. This would simply change the quantity demanded at this higher price. However, if there is a shift in the supply, which this means that there was a decrease in the input costs, there was an increase in the technology, which allowed us to produce more goods more efficiently using the same resources, that would cause a shift in the supply. So please remember that anything that has nothing to do with a price increase will shift your demand and your supply curves left or right. However, we also have to consider related markets. So very often, if there is a price increase in coffee, for example, there may be an increase in the demand for its substitute product, tea. And we call this the substitution effect. So this would be represented by two separate graphs. You would have to look at the movement along the graph for coffee. This would simply be depicted as such. Here you are showing that an increase in price has caused a decrease in quantity demanded. So we have moved from position A to position B. And this is depicted by the new price, which has now increased to P1, and a reduction in quantity shown here in my quickly drawn graph at Q1. Okay. However, at the same time, this shift in the change in price of coffee has caused a shift in the demand for tea. How do we know that? Well, simply because the price has not changed. Yet the quantity demanded has increased at every level, shown here by a shift D1 in the demand curve. All that has happened is there was an increase in quantity, shown here from Q1 to Q2. However, our price has remained the same. Okay. Obviously, this would happen vice versa. An increase in price could in fact decrease demand, in which case they would move closer to the origin, causing a shift to the left. Now, what happens when our demand and supply curves change simultaneously? Well, keep your head about you. You have to start off with your original equilibrium point. So you're simply drawing your demand and your supply curves and highlighting the price that the market has found equilibrium at and the quantity where demand and supply equal one another. If, however, there is a shift in the supply curve to the right, this implies that there was some technological advancement, something that made producing this product cheaper, more efficient, and able to produce more to the market. This is shown by this shift and our new equilibrium price shown here on our new supply curve S1 and its interaction with our original demand curve at D. This now shows that the quantity has substantially increased to Q1 and the price has also decreased to P1. This has been a major benefit to consumers. We have both received more quantity and at a reduced price. If, however, then we were to find out something nefarious about the product that we are demanding, that would cause a shift to the left of our demand curve from D to D1. What impact would that have on price? Well, because fewer people are demanding this product, it would cause a further shift down in the price demanded and supplied. Again, because fewer people are demanding the product, you'd have a shift in your demand curve to the left, which impacts the quantity supplied and demanded from the market at Q2. Okay, so all you have to do is simply decide in the case study provided whether you are moving to the right or the left. If there is an increase in supply, it will be related to a determinant and it should be logically possible for you to discern that there would be an increase in production. That would cause a shift to the right. Any decreases would shift to the left. Same with demand. If you can reasonably expect that the demand has shifted for a reason outside of price, you would have to draw a parallel line to the right of the demand curve to show an increase in demand. And vice versa, if you are trying to depict a decrease in demand, you would shift your curve to the left. Now we're going to look at government interventions. So there are times when government intervenes predominantly to either protect consumers, support producers, or ensure some level of fair competition. These interventions can take many forms, and I'm sure you've heard of a few of them. Maybe consider. Rent control in some cities is a perfect example of a price ceiling. So what this graph depicts on the right is it shows you, here is your demand curve, which shows that as the price decreases, more quantity of homes were demanded. At the same time, as the price increased, the supply of these homes increased substantially from a producer standpoint as well. Our natural market equilibrium is found at $600 and a quantity of 300 homes. However, if the government deems fit, they can come in and set a price ceiling. This is a limit, a maximum price set by the government. As you can see, price ceilings will always be below your market equilibrium because we are setting a maximum price below what the market would dictate. What happens here is that we cause a natural shortage because at this price of only $400, $200 less than the market has determined the value of these homes, we have a demand of 400 homes. Unfortunately, at this price, producers were only willing to sell 200 of these homes into the market, thus causing a deficit, a shortage of 200 homes in the market. Now we're going to consider price floors. In South Africa, this is very prevalent as we have minimum wage laws. So, essentially what happened is that the demand for labor is dictated or provided here by the demand curve D. The supply of labor is given by the supply curve S. Government, however, has deemed that PE, the natural price of labor, and QE, the supply and demand of labor in our economy, was insufficient. As such, they increased the price of our wages, making our labor more expensive to the market and setting it at PF. What this has done is create the opposite of a deficit or a shortage. We have created a surplus because at this higher price, the price that is higher than the market equilibrium, we have QS being supplied into the market. Unfortunately, at this higher price, the demand is substantially lower at QD. So while the original idea was to ensure that no one is exploited and that people are paid a fair wage rate, what has essentially happened in our economy is that we are very willing to work given our high unemployment rates, but there is very few jobs, very few producers willing to pay this higher price for the same labor. These price controls have dramatic welfare effects on our economy. They affect both the consumer and the producer surplus. They often create dead loss. There are people who are willing to work for below the minimum wage, but unfortunately, they cannot legally be employed. So we have reduced the overall market efficiency. Some groups often benefit while other people lose out. It's very hard to anticipate what the impact will be once these price controls take effect over the long term. Obviously, we can see that with rent control, there would be a decrease in the supply of these affordable homes and an increase in the demand for these affordable homes. If we look at minimum wage, our short-term effect looks pretty clear. There are higher wages for some workers who would ordinarily have been paid much less. The long-term effect are what we see today: reduced employment and massive shifts towards automation. There are also alternatives to price controls. Governments can use subsidies, taxes, and regulations to both encourage and discourage producers and consumers from certain behaviors. There are many alternatives to things like rent control. For example, our government offers subsidies for first-time homeowners. When we're evaluating these government interventions, it's important to understand that all of these policies involve some trade-offs. We have to sacrifice something in order to gain something else. And there are both intended and unintended consequences. Economic analysis obviously helps to predict these outcomes, but in the real world, these things vary. We're allowed to perceive or predict outcomes while using economic models and understanding that ceteris paribus is a factor of life, which means that we can ignore certain factors that we don't want to include in our models, which very often makes the models less effective in the real world. We also have to consider the global perspectives on these market interventions. Different countries approach market interventions differently. There are cultural, political, and economic factors that influence political policies on the ground. For example, there are varying approaches to healthcare markets around the world. Some economic systems have proven to be more effective at others. Some are more effective in the short term, others benefit consumers in the long term. Now we've reached the end, and I'd like you to just revise what market equilibriums mean in our economy and how these shifts take place. And we've also looked at government intervention and their potential impacts. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email or to pop a question into our form. Thanks so much. Have a lovely evening.